What would you do if you were the woman hired to fill a great house with flowers for another woman's engagement, and the most dangerous man on the coast found you crying in the cold room among the buckets, and asked you why, and you told him the truth without thinking, which was that nobody marries a fat girl, and watched him go absolutely still and then say quietly, "Then let us prove them all wrong"? She had not meant to say it. She had been on her feet since 4 in the morning, and she had spent the entire day building arrangements for a celebration of a love she was apparently not eligible for, and somewhere around the 9th hour of it, something inside her had simply given way. She had gone into the cold room to have 90 seconds alone, and the man who found her there was not supposed to be in that part of the house at all. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman who had been told what she was allowed to want, and of the ruthless man who heard one sentence and set about dismantling it. Effie Barlow had spent 30 years being told, gently and constantly, to be realistic. She was soft and generously curved, with a broad open face and permanently green-stained fingers, and she had grown up in a family that loved her and had, without ever raising its voice, taught her exactly what to expect. A mother who said kindly that she should focus on being useful. An aunt who said, at 15, that she would make somebody a marvelous friend. A cousin who said, at her own wedding, in front of everyone, that Effie should not worry because not everybody is meant for this sort of thing. Nobody had ever been cruel to her. That was almost the worst of it. They had simply agreed, warmly and unanimously, that certain doors were not hers, and Effie had believed them so completely that she had stopped noticing the doors existed. What none of those warm, well-meaning people ever bothered to discover was what Effie actually was underneath the apron. Because Effie Barlow was a grower, not a shop florist, though she had worked shops. She had come up through nurseries and glass houses, and she had a knowledge of plants so deep and so specific that other growers came to her with questions. She could look at a bloom and tell you the variety, the region, the season it had been forced in, and whether it had been grown under glass or outdoors. She could tell you which nursery had raised a plant from the shape of the leaf and the way it had been pinched out, because growers have habits the way tailors have stitches. And she had one thing more, which was that she bred roses, quietly, in a rented allotment glasshouse on the edge of the city, and had done since she was 19, and had produced, 4 years earlier, a cultivar that existed nowhere else on earth. And on the night everything changed, she was crying in a cold room at 11 at night, surrounded by buckets of somebody else's happiness, when a man came in for ice. The man was Augusto Neri, and he was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad, and dressed in charcoal, cut with lethal precision, the head of a family that owned the ports and the freight lines and the fear of every serious house for 100 miles. And he was rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice. He never needed to. The engagement party upstairs was his cousin's, and he had come down through the kitchens because he had reached his limit of being congratulated by people who wanted something, and he opened a heavy door, expecting an empty cold room, and found instead a woman sitting on an upturned crate among 40 buckets of white flowers with her face in her hands. She got up immediately and started to apologize. He said, "Do not." And then, "Why are you crying?" And Effie Barlow, who was too tired to be careful, said the thing she had never said out loud to another human being in her life. "Because I have made the flowers for 11 weddings this year," she said, "and I am very good at it, and nobody marries a fat girl." The temperature in that room, which was already 4 degrees, dropped 20 more. Augusto Neri stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he came in and let the door close, and he leaned against the steel bench opposite her, and he said, "Who told you that?" "Nobody," said Effie. "That is the whole point." Nobody ever said it. Everybody just agreed. He was quiet. Then he said quietly, "Then let us prove them all wrong." She laughed wetly because she thought he was being kind. He was not being kind. What he said next, she would think about for the rest of her life. He said that he had spent 15 years in rooms full of people who had decided in advance what he was and what he was for, and that he understood exactly what it was to have your whole future arranged by other people's assumptions, and that he had built an entire empire, mostly to make certain no one ever arranged anything for him again. He said, "I am not going to tell you that you are wrong about the world, because the world has clearly been consistent with you. I am telling you that the world is going to be corrected." And then he asked her name and wrote it down and went back upstairs to a party where 100 people wanted things from him, and Effie Barlow sat on a crate in a cold room and understood dimly that something enormous had just happened and that she did not know what it was. She found out 11 days later when the largest floral commission of her life arrived by letter. It was not charity, and he had gone to some lengths to make sure it could not be mistaken for charity. It was a contract properly negotiated for the flowers of every Neary family occasion for a year at a rate that made her sit down on her own stairs, with terms that required her to hire and to grow at a scale she had never attempted. She spent 2 days terrified. She read the terms 11 times, looking for the trap in them, and there was no trap, and that frightened her more than a trap would have, because a woman who has been taught what she is eligible for does not know what to do with an open door. She sat on her stairs on the second evening with the letter on her knees, and understood that she could refuse it and stay exactly where she was, and be safe and be small forever, and that nobody would ever blame her for it, and that she would know. Then she did it, and so began the strangest and best year of Effie Barlow's life, because Augusto Neary, having decided something, did not undecide. He came to the glass houses. That was the part nobody could account for, least of all his own people, that the head of the Neary family would appear at a nursery on the edge of the city at odd hours and stand among the benches in a suit worth more than the building, asking questions about grafting. He asked them properly too, which was the thing that undid her, because he did not ask the way people ask a woman about her hobby. He asked the way a man asks somebody who knows more than he does. He asked her opinion on things that had nothing to do with plants. He used it, and when he used it, he said whose it was out loud in front of his own men, which nobody had ever done for her in her life. He learned that she talked with her hands when she forgot to be self-conscious, and he set about, patiently, and without ever once making a speech, creating conditions in which she forgot, and Effie began to unfold. She hired 4 people, then 9. She stopped saying sorry when she disagreed. She caught herself one afternoon in the 4th month, standing in the middle of a room instead of at the edge of it, and had to put down what she was carrying for a moment. Every evening after the work was done, they sat over a decanter of amber liquor he poured for himself and a pot of tea he poured for her, and he told her about the father he had buried and the trust he had learned to bury with him, things he had said to no one. He learned she flinched at raised voices and softened at kindness, and it made him want to have a very calm word with a great many warm, well-meaning relatives. And one night at the glass-house door, his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, leaving a smudge of soil there, and he said, "Tell me to stop." And Effie, who had spent 30 years being told what she was not eligible for, said, "Do not," and he murmured good night into her hair like a man saying something sacred, "Fiore mio," and left her standing there with her heart going like a bird. But Effie, being Effie, had seen something in a photograph that made no sense, and it would not let her rest. The cruelty came at a formal gathering, and it arrived immaculately arranged. Augusto had brought Effie in a gown of deep plum, that celebrated every curve she had spent 30 years being told to minimize, and midway through the evening, a sleek, beautiful woman named Beatrice, who had spent 2 years positioning herself to become the next Signora Neri, cornered her by the tall windows with an audience in tow. "Oh, the flower girl," Beatrice said brightly, loud enough for the room, letting her eyes travel over Effie's body with theatrical sympathy. "In a proper dress." She smiled like a blade. "I am going to be kind to you, sweetheart, because nobody else in this room will be." He is making a point. Men like Augusto occasionally decide to demonstrate that they are above things, and you are the demonstration, and it is very effective, and it is entirely about him. When he has made his point, he will want a woman who was raised for this house, and nobody, and I do mean nobody, looks at a fat girl who carries buckets for a living and sees a wife. Do go back to the buckets. They suit you. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and the old Effie would have absorbed it, agreed with it, and gone quietly to check the arrangements. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not lower her eyes. "You are right that I carry buckets," Effie said, her quiet voice carrying with perfect clarity. "Which means I know exactly where every flower in every room in this city has come from, because that is my entire profession." She tilted her head. "And since we are being kind to each other, Beatrice, you should know that I have been looking at a photograph of the Ardizoni party in the spring, and there is a rose in the centerpiece that I bred myself, in a glass house on the edge of this city, and which exists in exactly 2 places in the world, and one of them is the walled garden of this house. She let it sit. Nobody bought it, because it is not for sale, so somebody carried it out of here. So do be careful whose buckets you are commenting on. I can tell you where a flower has been. The silence had teeth." Beatrice did not understand it, but a man standing just past her shoulder went the color of ash. And Augusto, who had crossed the floor in silence, took Effie's hand and pressed his lips to her green-stained knuckles in front of the entire gathering. "You never make yourself small in this house again, fiore mio," he murmured. "Not in my world, and never in front of me." But the man who had gone pale understood exactly what the flower girl had said, because he had carried it out of there himself, and he had assumed, as everyone always assumes, that a woman with buckets is not a person who looks at anything. The man was Ruggiero, Augusto Neri's consigliere, and he had been undone by an act of vanity, so small he had genuinely forgotten it. For 2 years, Ruggiero had been meeting the head of the Ardigione house in secret, patiently arranging the sale of the Neri family, and he had been faultlessly careful about every part of it. No calls, no documents, no pattern in his movements. But 8 months earlier, the Ardigione matriarch had complimented the roses in the Neri walled garden, which she had seen once, and Ruggiero, wanting very badly to be liked by the people he was betraying his family for, had cut a dozen and taken them to her. It had felt like nothing. It was nothing, a courtesy, a bunch of flowers, the sort of thing that leaves no trace whatsoever, in a world where evidence means paper and telephones and money, except the roses were not from a shop. They were a cultivar, bred by a woman in a rented glass house, grown in exactly 2 places on earth, one of which was the garden he had cut them from, and the other of which belonged to the woman herself. And they had appeared, in a photograph of a party, in the center of an artisan table, 8 months before Augusto Neri hired that woman to look after his flowers. Ruggiero smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Effie brought it to Augusto that night, and she brought it the way she brought everything, plainly and with the certainty of a woman who did not guess about plants but knew them. She had spent 9 days on it, because she had wanted, very badly, to be wrong. She had gone back to the photograph and enlarged it, and looked at the bloom, and there was no question at all because a rose she had bred herself over 4 years was not something she could mistake, and because the particular fault in it, a slight quartering in the centre that she had never managed to breed out and was quietly ashamed of, was clearly visible. Then she had gone to the walled garden and found the plant, and found on a lower cane the 8-month-old scars where a dozen stems had been taken, cut cleanly with secateurs by somebody who knew what they were doing, at a height that told her they had been cut by a tall man. Then she had gone to the household book, because great houses keep records of who enters the walled garden, and there were 4 names for that week, and 3 of them had been elsewhere on the day in question, and the 4th had been in the garden for 11 minutes at 9 in the morning, and had driven north that afternoon. She laid it out on the table without drama, the photograph, the fault in the bloom, the scars on the cane, the book, and Augusto Neri went very still. And then he did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask her twice. He did not send a man with a title to verify what a florist had said. He looked at a case built entirely out of a rose, assembled by a woman that world had spent 30 years being warm and well-meaning at, and said, quietly, "Ruggiero." "Yes," said Effie. Then he took her face in his hands and said, "If I move on him and he sees it coming, he will not come at me. He will come at you, and at that plant, because there is nothing else in the world that puts him in the Ardizone house." And neither of them knew that Ruggiero had already made that decision. The house went dark at 2:30. Effie was in the glass house behind the walled garden, because she had not been sleeping and had stopped pretending she would, and the power died and took the lights and the heaters and the vent motors with it, and every instinct, 30 years of night frosts and early starts had honed screened that something was catastrophically wrong. Augusto had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication. And Effie, standing in the dark among 2,000 plants, knew with terrible certainty that they had come while he was away, and that they had come for her, and for a rose. She did not scream, she did not faint, she did not run blindly. She thought, cold and clear, the way she always had at 4 in the morning when a frost was coming, and there was no one to help, and a whole year's work was at stake. Somewhere across the garden, a gate came off its hinges. And Effie Barlow did the thing that no one, friend or enemy, had ever thought to account for, because they were coming to destroy a plant, and they did not know the first thing about plants. She did not defend it. She had, in fact, defended it 4 years ago, and every year since, because that is what a breeder does. A cultivar does not live in one plant, it lives in cuttings. There were 11 of that rose in the world, and she had grown every one of them. And the parent was in the walled garden, and 2 were in her allotment, and the other 8 were with growers in 4 countries who had them under trial with dated records, because that is simply how the business works. They could burn the entire garden, and the plant would still exist in Devon and in Kerry and in 2 places she had never visited. So Effie did not hide the rose. She went to the potting shed, where the old wired line ran on its own circuit, and got one message out. And then she went out into the walled garden in the dark and did the only aggressive thing she had ever done in her life, which was to turn on the irrigation. Every glasshouse of that size runs on a pressurized system, and hers had 11 zones, and she knew every valve by feel, because she had installed most of them herself. She opened all of them at once, and then she opened the 2 that fed the misting lines in the propagation house, and in 90 seconds the walled garden and every structure in it became a black, roaring, 40-degree angle downpour in total darkness on a night already close to freezing. The men who had come in with torches and thin coats found themselves soaked to the skin within 4 seconds and unable to see anything at all, in a walled space they did not know, full of benches and standing water and 2,000 plants. 2 of them went down on the wet brick. 1 walked into a glass partition. And Effie Barlow, in her waterproofs and her boots, which she had been wearing since 4 that morning because that is what growers wear, walked through the middle of it along a path she had laid herself, and did not so much as slow down. And she heard, over the roar of it, one man who had not fallen and had not panicked, standing under the doorway of the propagation house with his coat over his head. "Effie!" called Ruggiero. "Clever girl!" She stopped. "You have flooded a garden," he called. "You understand that change is nothing. You understand that I am going to find that plant and put a spade through it, and that without it there is a photograph of a rose and nothing else." And Effie Barlow, standing in the streaming dark 12 feet away from him, did the one thing he never expected, because she had never once been the harmless thing he took her for. "You can put a spade through it," she said. "Silence. It is a cultivar, Ruggiero," she said, "not a plant. There are 11 of them, and I grew every single one, and 8 are with trial growers in 4 countries, with dated propagation records, and my name on them. And 2 are in an allotment glasshouse whose address is not written anywhere you can reach." She let the water fall between them. "You can destroy the one in this garden tonight, and it will not even inconvenience me, because the paperwork proving that rose exists, and where it came from, was filed with the breeder's registry 4 years ago by a fat girl who carries buckets. And the scars on the cane are 8 months old, and photographed, and the household book has your name in it." She paused. "You did not come here for evidence. You came here to lose 11 minutes, and a great deal of dignity." Ruggiero said nothing at all, which was the closest thing to a concession she would ever get. And in that silence, the gates beyond the wall came inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Augusto had come home. Time seemed to fracture. There was noise beyond the wall, brief and brutal and absolute, and Ruggiero turned toward it, and Effie, who had laid every path in that garden and knew where the brick ended and the gravel began, even under 2 inches of water, was already moving down the north walk and through the door in the wall, and had the bolt across before he had taken 3 steps. And then the garden filled with torchlight, and Augusto came through the wall door soaked to the skin, his eyes wild and searching. Nunzio, his loyal second, came behind him with a crowd of men, and the trap Ruggiero had spent 2 years building closed around him instead, in the middle of a flooded walled garden, on his knees on wet brick. Augusto reached Effie and took her by both arms. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I am fine," Effie said, steady even now, though her fingers curled into his soaked coat. "I turned on the irrigation. Everyone here is extremely wet. I would like to say that I am sorry about the brick paths, but I am not, because they will dry, and 2 of his men will not stop shivering until March." And Augusto Neri let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her wet hair, then framed her face in his shaking hands and looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. "You extraordinary woman," he breathed. 2 years he sat at my table, and every man I employ looked for money and telephones and papers, and you had him from a bunch of flowers he gave away to be liked." And then his voice cracked open entirely. "Do you know what I understood in that cold room?" he said hoarsely. "A woman who had built other people's happiness 11 times that year said that nobody marries a fat girl, and said it like it was the weather, and I have never wanted to correct a thing so badly in my life." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I told you we would prove them all wrong. Fiore mio. I would like to start formally, if you will have me." Ruggiero, who had smiled at Augusto Neri for years while arranging the sale of the family, learned the price of underestimating her before the week was out. Augusto did not act in blind rage. He let Effie lay the whole of it before the families, the photograph, the fault in the bloom, the 8-month-old scars on the cane cut at a tall man's height, the household book, and a breeder's registry entry filed 4 years earlier by a woman nobody in that room had ever heard of, all of it presented plainly by a florist. And when the houses had seen it, and the Ardizzone family found itself explaining a centerpiece, Effie did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So they did it her way. Ruggiero was stripped of everything and cast out alive, and the detail that followed him for the rest of his life was not the treason, but the manner of it, because the story went round every family on that coast within a month, and it was always the same, that Ruggiero, who was so careful, had been undone by a bunch of roses he gave to a woman he wanted to impress. He was not destroyed. He was simply, permanently, a joke, and the old men agreed that was considerably worse. And Beatrice, who had said that nobody looks at a fat girl who carries buckets and sees a wife, found that the Ardizzone party she had also attended became a subject of serious inquiry, and spent a long and humiliating season explaining an evening she could not explain, and afterward watched from the far end of every table Effie now sat at the head of. A year later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Effie Barlow stood in a glass house of her own, on land she owned, with 19 people working for her and a rose named for her grandmother going out to trial in 6 countries, and she did not make herself small for anybody. She wore rich colours, cut to celebrate every curve she had spent 30 years being told to minimize, and her hands were still green at the fingertips, and always would be. Augusto came in and stopped, simply to watch her work. "You are staring," she said, without looking up from the bench. "I will never stop," he said, crossing to her. "Do you know what I understood that night in the cold room?" he said quietly. "You were not bitter. That was the thing I could not get past. You said it the way a person reports a fact about the tide." He lifted her hand from the bench and pressed his lips to her soil-dark knuckles. "Everybody who loved you told you to be realistic, fiore mio, and they were warm about it, and they were wrong, and it took 30 years and a bunch of stolen roses to prove it." She looked up at the man the whole coast feared, who bowed to no one, and yet bowed entirely to her, and for the first time in her life she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 30 years being told, kindly, that certain doors were not hers, until she had stopped seeing the doors at all, and she had proven every last warm, well-meaning cruelty wrong, because the knowledge nobody had ever thought to ask her about had saved a family and a life. And because the thing she had built alone in a rented glasshouse had turned out to be the only evidence in the world that mattered. She had said in a cold room at 11 at night that nobody marries a fat girl. He had said, "Let us prove them all wrong," and by the time his enemy understood what she was, they already had. If Effie and Augusto's story of hidden worth, quiet defiance, and hard-won belonging moved you, if something in you turned over when she said that sentence in the cold room, and he refused to accept it, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who has been told, kindly and constantly, to be realistic. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us what was your favorite moment in Effie and Augusto's story.